Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we dive into the unexpected ripple effects of Russia's war against Ukraine and how they are reverberating all the way into Africa. Yes, although the continent might seem worlds away from the trenches of Eastern Europe, it is also one that is increasingly caught in the crossfire of this brutal conflict. We're not just talking about economic impacts or diplomatic maneuvers. Instead, we mean real, tangible consequences for millions of people. So let's get into it. Here is our latest report on this topic.
The West African nations of Mali and Niger have severe diplomatic relations with Ukraine, a move reportedly influenced by Russia. The decisions announced earlier in August have raised concerns about the growing influence of Russia in Africa. Mali was the first to break ties on August 4, accusing Ukraine of supporting Tuareg-led rebels, who inflicted heavy losses on Russian Wagner Group mercenaries and Malian soldiers in north of the country. Ukraine's foreign ministry described Mali's decision as hasty and regrettable, emphasizing that no evidence was provided to substantiate the claims. 2 days later, Niger followed suit, citing Ukrainian aggression as the reason for cutting diplomatic ties. Ukraine's foreign ministry dismissed these accusations as groundless and untrue. Jorge Teki, a spokesperson for Ukraine's foreign ministry, stated that these decisions were not made independently by Mali and Niger, highlighting their dependence on Russia. He also noted that this move is part of Russia's propaganda effort to portray Ukraine as involved in terrorism. Despite the setbacks, however, Ukraine remains committed to strengthening its relations with African countries. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba recently concluded a diplomatic tour of several African nations, including Malawi and Zambia, aiming to foster mutually beneficial ties.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. So first off, let's talk about why Africa even matters in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. Africa has long been a battleground for influence between global powers, with Russia being no exception. Russia, through its mercenary group Wagner and other proxies, has been entrenching itself in various African countries for years. They're involved in everything from military support to resource extraction, often propping up regimes that are anything but democratic. And with the war in Ukraine dragging on, Russia's footprint in Africa is becoming more pronounced as the Kremlin seeks to shore up support where it can, or perhaps distract the world from its bloody campaign on the Ukrainian soil. Now, you might be wondering, what does Russia get out of this? Well, quite a lot actually. Africa offers Russia economic opportunities. Think arms sales, mining contracts, and other forms of resource extraction that can help fund this war machine. But there is more to it, as Moscow also plays the influence game. By embedding itself in African conflicts, Russia can undermine Western interests on the continent, making it harder for countries in Africa to align with the West. In short, Africa is becoming another front in Russia's broader geopolitical struggle, one that's as much about ideology and power as it is about territory and resources. But what about the African nations themselves? How are they faring in all of this? Well, the short answer is not great. Take, for example, the food crisis that's been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the world's largest grain exporters, and when Russian forces blockaded Ukrainian ports, it sent shockwaves through global food markets. Many African countries heavily reliant on grain imports from Ukraine found themselves facing skyrocketing food prices and severe shortages. This isn't just an economic issue, it's a humanitarian crisis in the making, with millions of people at risk of hunger. But it doesn't stop there. The war in Ukraine has also led to a surge in Russian disinformation campaigns across Africa. Russia is trying to frame itself as a benevolent partner to African countries, contrasting itself with the neo-colonial West. The goal is to win hearts and minds in Africa and to sow distrust in Western institutions. And in some cases, it is working. Some African leaders and populations are starting to view Russia not as a meddling foreign power, but as a legitimate ally. Now, let's not forget the security implications either. Russia, through the Wagner Group, has been providing military support to regimes in countries such as the Central African Republic, Sudan and Mali. These regimes are often embroiled in conflicts with insurgent groups or opposition forces, and Russia's involvement is rarely about peacekeeping. Instead, it's about securing influence and resources. The presence of Russian mercenaries can actually make these conflicts more intractable, as they tend to prioritize the interests of their Kremlin paymasters over the stability of the region. In some cases, Russian involvement has even led to increased violence and human rights abuses, exacerbating the suffering of ordinary people. So, what can be done about this? The West, for its part, needs to wake up to the reality that Africa is becoming a key battleground in the broader geopolitical struggle with Russia. But the West also needs to engage with African nations on their own terms, offering real, tangible support that goes beyond the rhetoric of democracy and human rights. The war in Ukraine isn't just a European problem, it's a global one, with far-reaching consequences that extend all the way to Africa. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Dr. Philippe Assanzi, Associate Professor at the National Pedagogical University of Kinshasa. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much.
So, when looking at the relationship between African countries and Russia, Ukraine, and of course the overall perception of the conflict, let me ask you a very general question. Here in Europe, we of course have a fairly fixed perception of what this conflict is really about. But in the overall discourse, both in the academia, but also between ordinary people on the street, in the media, how is this really perceived on an everyday basis, in coverage, in discussions? Because I would like to get a glimpse of the real perception, as opposed to what many Europeans would like African leaders and members of the public to think about this.
Yeah, actually, from the start of this conflict, most African, be it within the academia or in the street or within government, the main impression is that this conflict does not concern us. This is about Europe. It's a European conflict. And we Africans, we have many conflicts in Africa, and we are used to war. We are used to seeing people being killed, being massacred. We are used to seeing conflict in the Middle East, in the Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Syria, in Iraq. So for us, this is not an exceptional issue, phenomenon. Is something which does not concern us, and that is the first thing. And the second thing is that we believe that Russia has some right to defend its interest, its security, although we do understand that Ukraine is an independent state and that the basic rules of international law has to be respected. So for us, we believe that this war in Ukraine has to be resolved through negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and the West. That is our impression. So we should not also forget that Russia has a very significant political capital in Africa, because Russia was very close to African countries, supporting them during the fight, the struggle for independence. So Russia has consolidated a very strong political relationship with many African states. So that's what I can say.
So do you think that this perception can be changed, for example, by diplomatic initiatives on the part of Ukraine? Dmytro Kuleba is now visiting a number of African countries, and he hopes to present a slightly different take on the subject, one in which Ukraine has found itself a victim of a neo-colonial conflict, essentially Russia being a colonizing power which does not recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, a bit like Western countries used to do in the dark days of colonialism back in the 19th century and before that. So would you say that this sort of narrative would find basically a fertile ground among the African public, would it be well received? Do you think that it can turn the public opinion towards Ukraine a bit?
Actually, you need to understand that African states are just like other actors of international system, of the international systems, as any other like group of states. African states do support, do defend, do promote their interest. This is about interest. So, as African state, we have our own interest. So we are not going to be influenced, to be manipulated by either Russia or Ukraine or the West. That is the first thing. So we do follow, we do promote our own interests. So we are very aware of what is happening in Ukraine, and we are aware of all these complex issues. That's the first thing. And the second thing, you should also understand that African states have already been involved in trying to find a peaceful solution to this conflict in Ukraine. African states, there's a couple of African states, a bunch of African presidents, head of state and head of government who traveled like last year to Russia and Ukraine, trying to find or to promote a peaceful like solution. So I think African states want to follow this the part of trying to promote a peaceful and negotiated solution formula for Ukraine. So that is our opinion. So we are not going to turn against Russia. We are not going to get Russia isolated. We're not going to break our relationship with Russia, because Russia is an important strategic economic partner of Africa. So at the same time, we do also want to have good relations with Ukraine. We do want to make sure that Ukraine independence, territorial integrity is respected. So that is also important for us. So we do want a more like a balanced solution, which we have to come from a negotiation part. Yeah, that's what I can say.
So you've mentioned the question of interests. Now, do you think there is a difference in which Russia and Ukraine are approaching their relationships with various African nations? Looking, for example, at the situation in Mali, also in Niger, where Russia is supporting a specific part of the political spectrum, the regimes which are actually in power in these countries right now. Would you say that it is the same as Ukraine's attempt at outreach and trying to engage with various countries? Specifically, I'm referring to the fact that Russia does have a tendency to try and become involved in local or regional conflicts, but also of creating or supporting governments which are likely to be very friendly towards Russia, but also which are likely to be acting in a less friendly way towards other countries, such as, for example, France or the United States.
But I would say what is going on right now in the Sahelian region, like in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, is a new Cold War. We are witnessing a new Cold War between the West and Russia. So this is a new Cold War, which is not in the interest of Africa, actually, because what we are seeing is that Russia is supporting the government of Niger, Mali. These are junta. These are military junta who took powers. These are not necessarily legitimate governments, although they do have support, popular support, but these are not governments which were elected. At the same time, now Ukraine is also supporting opposition groups, rebel groups like the Tuareg in the northern part of Mali. And this situation is not good for Africa. We do not want Africa to be the scene of a new Cold War. So this is a new Cold War. And either Russia or Ukraine, they are here in Africa to defend their interests. So it's about interest, and I do not think that we have on one side angels, and on the other side we have devils. So these are actors who are objective, who are defending the core, the interest. So it's also about Africa. Africa also has to defend its interests. That's why the governor of Senegal decided to summon the Ukrainian ambassador to Dakar when he did support the killings of Malian soldiers in northern Mali. So he tried to remind him that he had to respect the Vienna Conventions on diplomatic relations and tried not to interfere in the internal affairs of Mali and other African countries. So we Africans, we want Africans to be left alone. We want the independence of African countries, the territorial integrity of African countries to be respected. We do not want Africa to be the scene of another Cold War.
So can you name a country that's based outside of Africa, but that is engaging with African countries, which does not make the same mistake of, acting in a condescending way, of trying to impose its own rules, its own ways of thinking, which is basically acting in a way that's respectful and which has created this sort of pattern that other countries perhaps should follow? Now that, as you've mentioned, Africa wants to follow its own path and does not want to be used as a pawn on this geopolitical chessboard. Has any country done justice to this sort of idea of sovereignty, independence, and allowing everyone to basically follow their own path?
I think every state actors that come into Africa comes with his interest to defend its interest, be it geopolitical interest, economic interest, or else. So I think it is up to African countries to make sure that those foreign players who come to Africa do not undermine the core African interest. So it's about African to make sure. So I'm not going to actually say which state or which power, world power, regional power are better for Africa or are respecting African interest, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and others are not doing so. So I'm not going to go there. So I think the most important issue is that African state, especially within the framework of African Union, they have to make sure that all powers, foreign powers that come and engage with African states do respect the core interests of African countries. So yes, and Africans, we want to have good relations with all world powers, with the United States, with France, with China. China is a very important global power and who is playing a very significant role in African economic arena. So we want to have a good relation with all these powers, including Russia. So Africa want a multipolar world. We want a multipolar world. A multipolar world is in the interest of African countries. We do not want a Cold War. We want a multipolar world where the rule of law will be upheld, will be respected by all players.
So a world in which there is a recognition that Africa is composed of free countries, no longer a colony, no longer a battlefield for global powers to use in their own interests. Philippe Assanzi was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. In response to the ongoing fighting in the Kursk region, Russian authorities have announced plans to relocate displaced residents to occupied areas of eastern Ukraine. Although the exact extent of the Kursk incursion is hard to measure, more than 100,000 Russians had to be evacuated.
As Ukrainian troops push on in Kursk, the regional governor Alexei Smirnov stated that evacuees will be accommodated in resorts and house pass near the Azov Sea, especially in the Zaporizhia region. This initiative is being coordinated with Yevgeny Balitsky, the Moscow-appointed head of the Zaporizhia region. The relocation effort comes after Ukrainian troops advanced in the Russian border region, possibly displacing up to 120,000 people. The first groups of evacuees are expected to be transported to temporary accommodation soon. Multiple sources have stated that Ukraine has taken control of at least 800 square kilometers of territory in Russia's Kursk region, more than Russia has captured in the neighboring Kharkiv region. Ukrainian military chief Alexander Syrsky has reported to President Volodymyr Zelensky that his troops now control around 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, more than 70 settlements, and are continuing their offensive operations.
Recent intelligence from the United Kingdom has revealed a significant increase in waterborne diseases among Russian troops. The rise in infections is attributed to the use of unsafe water sources on front lines in Ukraine.
As it turns out, the Ukrainian army is not the only threat endangering Russian soldiers' lives. Unsafe water poses a serious health risk to the troops on the front lines. A report by UK intelligence claims that the lack of access to clean water has forced soldiers to rely on contaminated sources, leading to outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery and cholera. The situation is exacerbated by inadequate medical supplies and poor sanitation practices, further endangering the health of the soldiers. This surge in illness not only affects the immediate well-being of the troops, but also impacts their operational effectiveness. The scale of the issue, however, is hard to measure.
Russian leader Vladimir Putin has reiterated his support for the establishment of a full-fledged Palestinian state during talks with the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. The meeting, held at the presidential residence outside Moscow, underscored Russia's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Vladimir Putin has regularly called for the creation of a Palestinian state as a long-term solution to the conflict in Israel. During a meeting with Palestinian Authority President in Moscow, he reiterated that this scenario was the only way to ensure lasting peace in the region. He also expressed deep concern over civilian casualties in Gaza, highlighting Russia's commitment to supporting the Palestinian state. Abbas's visit to Moscow, initially scheduled for last November, was postponed due to escalating violence following the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas. Despite maintaining relations with both Israel and Palestinian authorities, Russia has not yet designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. Last month, the Kremlin even strongly condemned the killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh by an Israeli strike in Iran.
Armenia and Azerbaijan have moved closer to finalizing a peace agreement, overcoming a major hurdle in their negotiations. Both nations have expressed a strong interest in concluding a peace agreement swiftly, with Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev indicating that 90% of the draft peace pact's language has been agreed upon.
The Armenian Foreign Ministry announced that Azerbaijani officials have agreed to drop a contentious provision from the draft peace agreement, which would have granted Baku a land corridor connecting the Nakhchivan exclave to Azerbaijani proper. This issue, known as the Zangezur corridor, had been a major striking point in the peace talks. Despite this advancement, however, significant challenges remain. One of the key obstacles is Azerbaijan's demand that Armenia amends its constitution to clearly acknowledge that Nagorno-Karabakh is not part of Armenia. While the Armenian government has shown some openness to this idea, it remains in sensitive issues domestically, with many Armenians opposing the recognition of Karabakh laws without guarantees for the right of return for those who fled the region.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.